Oh, it already unplugged me. Back over. All right. All right, y'all ready to start? No? Still eating? Britt says yes, and well, he's the people's warden, so guess we're gonna go with that. All right, I'm gonna open in prayer for this study, and then I do have one short announcement, and then we're gonna move into it. Maybe two short announcements. So please pray with me. Lord, we come before you. We give you this time. We ask that you would consecrate this time as sacred and holy, that you would feed our hearts as well as our minds, Lord, and that this would be an aid as we walk throughout the season of Lent. We ask this in your name, amen. All right, y'all may be, you're already seated. All right. I just moved like straight into church mode. There's a couple of things that I really value, and because of COVID, I've lost track of some things, and so I want to gather them back up. But I think a couple weeks ago, somebody spoke to me about wanting a Bible, and I said, I can take care of that for you, and then I completely forgot who you are. So what I'm asking is, if you talk to me about a Bible, I really do want to get you a Bible. So please remind me so that I can do that. And then that brought me to the next point is, if you all don't have Bibles or you want a good Bible that is a good version, a translation that's trustworthy, that has a commentary in it, please talk to me afterwards. This is part of what it means to be a priest. My job is to get Bibles into your hands. So please talk to me so I can get you a Bible. It's free. It's on me. It's yours. I can show you how to read it. I can show you how to go through and, the best way to approach it. I remember, like my first 3 years here, I did this, and I got to do it with Dick and Linda Tillman. And I bought them Bibles, and then they called me, and they said, can you help us? Can you show us where to start and what to do? So I went over, and they made a magnificent dinner. And then we ate, and then afterwards, we just went through the Bible. And it is one of those moments for my time in ministry that I will never forget. Like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So if you need a Bible and you want to know how to walk through it, talk to me. Let's make it happen. So talk to me afterwards about Bibles if you want them. If not, I'm going to assume you have a great Bible. All right, we're moving in. So we're looking at the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And I've never done this. I've never, just looked at the Torah. It's only 5 books of the Bible, but they're giant books of the Bible. Genesis alone is 50 chapters. So we are like flying over the Torah. We are just looking at the high points of the Torah because it's a lot. And I don't have a ton of time. So we're going to try to hit the high points, but there's a couple introductory things that I do want you to know. The first is it generally just means 5 scrolls, like Pentateuch, just 5 scrolls. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. 5 scrolls. And although they're usually translated as law, a better translation for it is instruction. So when you hear it talked about in the Bible, it will say the law and what? And the prophets. The law and the prophets. And what it's saying is the prophets, we know what the prophets are. There's 4 major prophets, and I think there's 16 minor prophets. There's a lot of prophets in the Old Testament. Then you have the history books. But the law is generally the Torah or the Pentateuch. It's the first 5 books. So it's basically gathering up the Old Testament when it says the law and the prophets. Just basically means pretty much the whole thing. And so what we're looking at is the Torah, but it's more than just the law, it's instructions. It's so if you were to read, the laws of Florida, you sit down and you go through all the laws. Yes, it's the law, but it's also instructions. If you do this, you're going to receive this. And if you do this, then you're going to get this. Like, it's more than just laying it out. It's more detailed with instructions. So the first 5 books, really, what they do is they lay the theological and historical groundwork for the entirety of the Bible. So why I say, if you don't understand the Old Testament, you're never going to be able to understand the New Testament. Because what Jesus is doing is going back to the Old Testament a lot and gathering up the Old Testament and bringing it into, that time. Part of what Jesus has to do is to show that he's not deviating from the religion. He is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies. So a lot of your Old Testament is in the New Testament. A lot of what Jesus is doing, he's doing because of the Old Testament. So it's really, really important. I know a lot of Christians just, if you're lucky enough and they're going to sit down and they're going to spend some time to read their Bible, they're generally going to read the New Testament, right? Most of the time, that's kind of where we settle in. But the Old Testament is really, really important. So we're going to do the first 5 books. So first 5 books, Torah, Pentateuch, we've already gone over that. But it's better to understand them not as 5 books, but one book with 5 parts. That's generally how it's referred to. It's one book, and it has 5 chapters, if you will. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, each a chapter, but it's one solid unit. So, and you can see this in the New Testament, because when you get to the New Testament, it will say the book of the law. It doesn't say the books of the law, it says the book of the law. It's one book. Same thing in Joshua, the book of the law. Same thing in the New Testament, the law, not the books of the law, like the law. There's just one. So it's generally best to understand the Torah as just one book, 5 parts. Does that make sense? It's pretty simple. All right, so we're going to jump right into Genesis because what I've tried to figure out is how to do this in 4 weeks. Or 10 weeks. It's a big section. So I do want to warn you that we're going to start out really, really slow. Meaning that my goal today is to make it 11 chapters into Genesis. and that's it, an end. But those 11 chapters are really, really important. So, if you're reading a book, generally you want to figure out what are the main sections of a particular book. And so the same thing with the books in the Bible, they have sections where they're easily kind of sectioned off. This is distinct from this, and this is distinct from this. So you can divide it up into sections, not just chapters, but actually like big sections. So Genesis is easily divided up into two different sections. The first section is the first 11 chapters of Genesis. The second section is chapters 12 through 50. So that's a really big section. But the way that they're generally divided up is the first 11 chapters are the prelude to Israel. It is leading up to Israel. But before that, you have, or after that, you have the patriarchs. So once Israel's established, then you have your patriarchs. You've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So you got your patriarchs that come after that. But the first 11 chapters are all leading up to that point. So we are just going to deal with the first part of Genesis, which is the prelude. But I do have an important question to ask. If you're sitting down and you're reading through Genesis, one of the things that you have to ask yourself right at the beginning is, what kind of genre am I entering into? How should I be reading this? So should I be reading it as apocalyptic literature? Should I be reading it as history? Should I be reading it as allegory? How do I sit down and read Genesis? What is this trying to communicate to me? So there's generally two ways that you read the first 11 chapters of Genesis. The rest of Genesis is almost always read historically, as historic events. Now you can push back on that, and we'll have tons of fun next week pushing back on that. But the first 11 chapters, how do you read these? So a lot of people reading the first 11 chapters will read it from a historical viewpoint. So what they're saying is that God created the world, and this is how God created the world. There's a fall that takes place, and this is how it happened. What I mean by that is there's a real Adam and a real Eve, and there was a real snake, and there was a real apple, and all of the things that take place in the beginning of Genesis actually happened. That would be a historical interpretation. God created the world in 7 days, took the rib bone out of Adam, made Eve, all of that. You tracking with me? That's a historic reading of Genesis chapter 11. There's also, I have worked very diligently on this for probably the last 8 years. Because I'm just going to tell you, it's the next slide, but I'm just going to tell you, I do not read the first 11 chapters of Genesis historically. I just don't. Now, that's not for me to say that you can't or that you shouldn't. I read the first 11 chapters of Genesis as theological stories. And so I'll unpack that a little bit, but that's how I read the first 11 chapters. The reason that I do it is that the writing style in the original language, the Hebrew writing style, is very different than it is in chapters 12 through 50. And it appears as though whoever wrote, and generally we ascribe these books to Moses, but whoever wrote these books addressed or thought differently in writing the first 11 chapters than they did in chapters 12 through 50. So I generally read it through a theological lens. And here's what I'm going to say about I don't think that it matters at all. I don't think that it matters if you read it historically or if I read it theologically, because the same points are being communicated. There are huge arguments about this, and so I just want to head it off right at the beginning. You can consider me a heretic. I do not read these as historic chapters, as this is how this happened. I read them as theological explanations for the world that you and I live in from God. So, as I go through, I'm going to point out on each one of these instances how we read it, or the lens through which we are approaching this, does not matter as long as you're taking each approach seriously. So I'll walk you through that, but I prefer to read it as theological, and not because they're too unbelievable. I know a lot of people will look at the story of Noah's Ark and they'll say, I just can't believe they got all those animals on there. It's a logistical nightmare. And what is he going to do? Like, how did he get the animals? If God can come into the world and take on flesh and die on a cross and rise again and ascend to the Father and come back, then he can definitely do an ark. Like, there's no reason that I'm throwing this away because it's too unbelievable. Like, the New Testament is full of unbelievable, crazy stories, like God becoming man. Like, that's absurd. He can definitely do an ark. So I'm not throwing this out because I think that it's too unbelievable. I'm reading it differently because I think that's how the Bible intended you to read it. So I had a seminary professor who used to say all the time, we concede nothing to liberalism in reading the Bible as it was meant to be read. Meaning that if you're sitting down and you're reading something as allegory because it was meant to be allegory, you haven't become a biblical liberal. You are just reading the Bible as it was meant to be read. I think the first 11 chapters are clearly different from the chapters after. So I read them through a theological lens. Does any of this make sense? Sort of. I'm going to explain it as we go through. Either way, the truth of the text remains. The theological truth that God desires to communicate to us are equally valid in both. I've already said that. So we'll move right into Genesis creation. So here's the theological emphasis in creation. Okay. The first part of creation about God, that there's one God who is sovereign over all things because he created all things, who always existed as the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. When you read through the creation narrative, whether you read it historically or theologically, what you're supposed to walk away with is that. That's it. Like, that's what you're supposed to grab from creation. That God created the world. That God created everything that exists in the world, that you and I live in this world, and God created it. And he is sovereign over the entire world. He has always existed as the triune God. You can read the creation narrative historically, you can read it theologically, but this is what you're supposed to gain from it. Is that inaccurate? If you read it theologically, you're going to get all of those points. If you read it historically, you're going to get all those points. You might get more points. You might, if you're reading it historically, then you're stopping and you're like, oh, this is exactly how God created the world. So what I'm saying is that when I read Genesis chapter 1, I don't read it as I know precisely how God created the world, but rather I know that God created the world. I know that God created all that exists. I know that God reigns over all that exists and is in control of it. And I know from the very beginning that God has existed as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And those are the things that I have to know. Does that make sense? Okay.
You continue to say He created the world and all that is in it. And there's something about He created the whole universe, not just the world?
Yeah, I use
Okay.
universe and world together
There's a big difference.
as the same thing. It's just a language thing. Yeah, the entire universe, all that exists, everything that possibly exists, God has created.
Okay.
And so if you're reading it, either lens is going to give you those things. And those are the things that we want to take away from the Bible. You can sit down and you can fight over, did he do it in 7 days, or was it a literal 7 days? Were they actually 24 hours because he started creation before he made time? So how does that work? And you can argue over all these things and not gain this. And I think this is what we do. We sit down, we read the Bible, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in a million arguments over these minute details that really don't matter, because this is all that matters. That God created it, He's sovereign, He's triune, and He created all of it. So when you're reading through the creation narrative, I think what you want to be able to say, what you want to gather up is this. Now, it doesn't just give you information about God. It also gives you information about humanity. That we were created by God and created in His image. That we are image bearers of God in the world around us. That we were made man and woman to be fruitful and to multiply. That these are all things that the story tells us that are true in either lens in which you're approaching Genesis 1 through 11. And these are the important things to grab onto. That we're created by God, created in His image, and we were made man and woman to be fruitful and multiply. So creation narrative tells you a lot about God. It tells you a lot about humanity. What else does it tell you? It tells you about creation. And the main thing that it tells you about creation is that it was created good. And that's a really important thing to grab onto. And maybe you say, well, I don't really see the importance of it. Let me ask you, have you ever had a conversation with somebody who got devastating news, or is struggling, or their whole life has fallen apart, or they're just angry at God, and they say this or something like this: I could never worship a God that created a world like this. How could God create this? And your answer is, He didn't. It was good. And that's a really important concept to be able to grab onto, is that the world that you and I live in, according to Genesis chapter 1, is not the world that God created. It is a distorted version of the world that God created. He didn't create this world. And so when He created it, He stepped back, He looked at it, and He said, it is good. So you got information about God, information about humanity, information about creation. I think these are the key things that every Christian, when they're reading Genesis, should walk away from in that first chapter. And you will walk away with all these things using either lens. Now does it make sense? It's looking at it through a theological lens. What is God telling me in this story? What is God revealing to me in this particular story? And I don't have to sit down and argue whether it's 7 literal days or 24-hour periods and all the ridiculous things that other people argue over. Because I'm reading it, trying to gain what God has given to us in this chapter. So, questions, comments, anything you all want to? All right. So if you move on from, I do have one last thing. It does also communicate covenant. And this is the very beginning of God making covenants. And the reason that it's so important is because you're going to see this. I think there's 8. I'm not entirely sure. I can't remember 7 or 9 or 8, but I think it's 8. I think there's 8 different covenants in the Old Testament that God makes. So over and over and over again, you're seeing God making covenants. The first one is going to take place with Adam. And if you follow through the Old Testament, what you'll see is that all of those covenants get broken. Broken covenant, broken covenant, broken covenant. And it's never God that's breaking the covenant. It is over and over and over again, we as human beings that are breaking the covenant, and God creates a new covenant. So you have, in this covenant, you have a love, the love and tender care of God is apparent throughout the creation narrative. He prepares everything for them, creates an ideal home. In his gentle breath, he provides life. They have great intimacy with God. Yet even in the very beginning of creation, what you have is the possibility for disobedience to exist. And that's where the covenant comes in. If you remember the covenant that God makes with Adam, what's the covenant?
Don't eat from the tree.
I am God. I am the creator. I am the one who sustains all things. I have given you all of this, and all of this is yours. Just do not touch this. And you know, that's like the human condition, right? The moment that you say, you can have anything you want, except this. It could be the grossest thing in the world. If I told my kids, you can have anything you want except this, that will create within them a desire for that thing. And so, even in creation, what you have is the possibility, the subtle possibility of disobedience and broken relationship. It is not a necessity at this point. They do not have anything in them that necessitates that they disobey God. And that's important because you and I do. But they didn't. They didn't have anything that said that they had to disobey God. But they did. And what you find is that possibility becomes a reality later on. But God makes a covenant with Adam that all of creation is at his disposal, except for one thing. So you see at the very beginning, God is a covenant God. This is the creation narrative on its high points, what you need to know about the creation narrative. If you move on from there, you get into a subcategory, which is a really cool category. And I'll be able to walk you through this fairly quickly. But this is this is one of my favorite sections of the entire Bible, chapters 3 through 11. And it's a subcategory of the larger category. And in here, what you see, it looks like very strange, unrelated stories. So what are some of the stories that you have in here? You've got what? You've got Tower of Babel. What else you got?
Cain kills Abel.
What's that?
Cain.
Yeah, you got Cain and Abel. What else you got?
Noah's Ark.
You got the big boat, yeah? You got Noah's Ark. Yeah, we're gonna shoot that under Noah's Ark. What's in Genesis chapter 3? You should know what's in Genesis chapter 3 immediately. The fall. So you got that. And there might be another story in there. I can't remember. But you got these, what seems to be unrelated stories. But what is actually taking place is very interesting. In reality, the unit is carefully put together to show the moral failure of humanity. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So it begins with the fall, and then each of the stories afterwards is showing a further decline, a further decline, a further decline, until you get to where it's real bad. And what it's meant to do is to show you the effects of sin. That once sin takes root in our lives, it begins to, it doesn't just, okay, now you're a sinner and you're going to be a sinner like this. It continually drags you down, and to worse and worse and worse. And it's just amazing how it's written and put together. So you got, look back at the possibility is now going to become a reality in chapter 3. So in chapter 3, what you have is this devastating change that's going to take place. Because up until chapter 3, God had created the world, and the world lived with God and experienced God, real relationship with God. And chapter 3 is going to change all of that. And that's why chapter 3 is such an important part of the Bible, because it's one of those hinges where once you read it, nothing is the same. Nothing is the same as it was in chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3 changes the entirety of the course that was taking place. So you get there, and chapter 3 is going to introduce a new character. You've got the serpent, which is representing Satan in our lives. And so you have the serpent, the great deceiver, who challenges the goodness of God by getting Adam and Eve to rebel, not just against God, but against one another too. And this is one of the things that I think that we miss quite a bit is, yes, they disobey God, but you all remember when God comes in and he addresses Adam, what did you do? And and Adam immediately is, she did it. And so all of a sudden, what was this harmonious individuals with God is now there's tension between God and humanity, but there's also tension between human to human. There's vertical tension, there's also horizontal tension. What was never there is now very much present and a reality. And so you have devastating change. You've got the serpent who deceives them, and you got humanity is changed. You have a loss of innocence, a loss of access to God, a loss of the garden. You remember when God comes to them, and what do? Besides tell on each other? They hide. And why do they hide? Because they're naked. And what does God say to them? Who told you were naked? Like there's this loss of innocence and a loss of access to God that before God would come and walk among them and they would be thrilled. I remember when that changed, like for me, like there was a time when my parents would come home and I was so excited to see my parents. And then there was a time when I was, I was thrilled when my parents left. Or I was happy when they weren't home. And when they came home, I was sad. But there's a loss that takes place there as well. A loss of the garden. This is a painting of them being expelled from the garden, the place that God had created for them. But, they don't just lose stuff, they gain stuff too, and stuff that you don't want to gain. And so they gain sin and pain and disease and death and all the things that you and I still live with in the world, and all the things that people say, well, because these things exist, I could never worship that kind of God that would create that. He didn't create it. You and I created it. And how did we create that? Through our own free will. Because the only way that God can actually make a human being and have a loving relationship with that human being without that human being being a robot is to provide that individual with free will. And free will is what brings all of this into play. So you and I have some freedom. Now, I'm always very clear on this. We have a variety of freedom, but we do not have the freedom to choose God. Our hearts will never, of their own desire, choose God. It is always God working in us that enables us to choose God. Of our own desire, we will always choose something else. And you can see this throughout the Bible over and over and over again. Jennifer?
So there's a delineation where humans choose and make a decision. But they could have chosen to live forever.
Yeah.
They could have chosen the tree of life. It wasn't forbidden, but they would have been forever innocent in the garden.
Yeah, so for you and I, because we are sinful, and that's just a part of who we are, we don't actually have that choice. We are born sinful. And you don't have to do too many studies on children to realize that they're sinful very early on. They don't have to learn it. They're super selfish, like right out of the gate. So, I mean, it's a part of who we are. But Adam and Eve actually, in the story, had the choice. They could have. They weren't by necessity forced to choose to be sinful. They could have followed God, but they didn't because it's our natural kind of tendencies. But they could have. But you and I do not necessarily have that choice. So it's a loss of all that stuff. It's also a gain of all that horrible stuff that you and I do not like and wish that we didn't have to deal with. Okay, is that a hand?
That's a hand without being trying to repeat. You say we don't have the choice to choose God, but we have the choice to accept God.
Yes, because...
So we're using choose and accept.
Well, you would accept God because God's already working in your heart. If God's not working in your heart, if God's not drawing you, you will never walk down that road. But when God begins that work, that regenerating of your heart, when God begins to actually call you and work in your life, then that opens up the avenues. And for all of humanity, God is drawing us. And God is pressing in on us and opening up avenues for us to find Him. But if God were to, and we've talked about this in the Bible study quite a bit, when you read sections of the Bible and it talks about God hardening somebody's heart, so God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it's not necessarily that God said, I'm going to come down and that person's going to have a hard heart and I'm going to give it to them. God just removes God's self from that individual's life. And when God's removed, then there's nothing within us that will naturally propel us to seek God. We will seek anything else. And you can see this. You can see this when people encounter very difficult situations in their life, and everybody will encounter them differently. But you will see individuals who will try everything possible in the world except for God. And so the human condition is just basically that we require God pre-working in our life. And the good news for you and I is that God is pretty much always working in our life. But if he were not, you and I, of our own free will and desire, would not choose God. Does that make sense? I know that everybody wants to think, hey, I would be the one that would choose God. It's unlikely. It's highly unlikely that we would travel down that road, because what that road is sacrificing ourselves and lifting up God. And you and I, generally, our tendency is to elevate ourselves. That is generally tendency of humanity. And if it's not ourself, then it's something else, a thing around us. And I've shared with the Bible study John Calvin's quote that the human heart is an idol factory, meaning that when you tear down one idol in your life, your heart will just by nature create more. It will create more things that you place above God. And some of those things are very good things. Some of us place our family above God. And family's a great thing. It should have a high priority in your life. But it should never take the place of God. And when it does, it becomes an idol. It becomes something that has to be sacrificed because it's not in its correct location. It can be right under it, but God is always supposed to have that primary place in our life. And so, but our hearts will always create these things that we place above God. And if we are looking for solutions and ways out of problems, generally we will seek out a variety of things before we will seek out God. And many of us will seek out, an infinite number of things. But you lose all that, you gain all that. It's, ultimately we lost. But then you get to the story of Cain and Abel. And this is where you begin to see that dramatic drop. Because you can see how quickly the world has fallen into sin. How quickly we've gone from eating forbidden fruit to murder. One chapter. One chapter in the Bible. In chapter 3, we're eating forbidden fruit. Don't eat this fruit. Well, I'm going to eat it anyways. In chapter 4, we're now murdering. This is the first murder in the Bible. It's 4 chapters in. So it doesn't take long for humanity to descend pretty quickly. And so, first murder, here we see the brother, Cain, kills Abel, illustrates how quickly. I've already gone over that. The other thing that's really interesting about this is in chapter 4, what you begin to see is God creates and humanity destroys. So we are, reversing the creative work of God. So God has created the world. God has put humanity in the world to live and dwell. And then what humanity is doing is reversing that work. We're killing the people. And you can extend this even further, and you could talk about the planet and how we're, further killing the planet that God created with our lifestyle that we live today. You can take us as far as you want to, but what you see is that God does this creative, amazing work, and then our lives are generally a reversing of that work. And you see it in the very beginning. God creates and gives life. Humanity kills and takes life. And so one chapter in. Then you move on to the genealogy. Genealogy is super cool because I know genealogies are generally not cool, but they are in this part. First of all, if you were to take each of the individuals and you were to what their name means, and I'm not huge into this kind of stuff, but even this intrigued me. It's man appointed mortal sorrow, but blessed God shall come down, teaching his death shall bring the despairing comfort and rest. It's kind of cool. I don't know if there's any merit to it, but I thought I would share it with you because I think it's kind of interesting. But the genealogy is really important all on its own. What you see, see if I want to go down one more. It shows sinfulness throughout the generations. So what the genealogy is meant to do is to take you from Adam and show you that Adam's sinfulness has gone down to Seth, and then Enoch and Kenan, and all the way down to Noah. And so the sinfulness that Adam earned is now passed down generationally. And that's important for you and I because that generational sin has not stopped. And that's why you and I do the things that we do. That's why we are the way that we are. But the genealogy is what it's taking you from Adam to Noah. And in a sense, what it's doing is it's showing you the sinfulness coming down. Boom, 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 to the next person. And then you get to Noah. You get to the story of the flood. So right from the genealogy, it's giving you the genealogy. It's basically said, hey, what started with Adam came all the way down to Noah. Now let me tell you about Noah. And then it's going to tell you the story about the flood. And you might think, well, Noah was saved on the boat. He was the righteous one. And then I'm going to ask you, what did Noah do immediately when he gets off the boat? He gets drunk. But while he was on the boat, I guess he was all right. All right. So you get to the flood, and the flood is basically, so you went from eating forbidden fruit to murder to the flood. And what the flood is illustrating is that this sinfulness that started with Adam, that's come all the way down, has so infected the world that what God has to do is destroy it. That it is no longer redeemable. He's got to destroy the world because it is so plagued with the sinfulness that started from eating that forbidden fruit. And so you get to the story of the flood, just further illustrating the sinfulness of humanity. And you get to the wickedness. This is verse 5. You get the wickedness of humankind was great on the earth, and every inclination and their thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So it's telling you, this is why I did this. Humanity is in such a bad state that there's no redeeming it. I have to wipe it out. And then you got Noah and his family get on the ark, which continues humanity. Now, again, you can read this historically, and nobody in here, hopefully, is going to beat you up over that. A lot of people read this historically, and I think it's a great reading of the text. You can also just read this through the theological points that what does God want to share with me in this story? What are the points that God has for me in this? And you're going to get the same point. You're going to end up at the same place. I've done it over and over and over again. So you get to the flood, and then I'm about to wrap this up. You get to the Tower of Babel is kind of like the last straw. And what is the Tower of Babel? Why is this the last kind of this is after the flood. Why is this like way down here compared to the flood? Why did this drop down another level? The Tower of Babel. Yeah, because before it's man, humanity against humanity, which is all sin against God. But now they're going after God. Now they're like, we're gonna go up. And so what you have in the Tower of Babel is this, I'm sure you're all familiar with the story that they all spoke the same language, and they all decided that they were going to build this great tower that was going to go up into the heavens. And then God mixes up their language, and because if they're unified and they can speak the same language, then they can accomplish anything. But the Tower of Babel is really interesting because it's the second place. We're only 11 chapters in Genesis, and it's the second place where you see the Trinity already. The first place was where? In the creation narrative. Let us make man in our image. It's plural language, and he's not talking to the angels. A lot of people put forward the idea that, well, he's speaking to the angels. No, he's not speaking to the angels because the angels do not have creative power. The angels are not brought into that level. It's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Let us. And in the Tower of Babel, you have the same language taking place when God says, let us go down and mix up their language. Again, the angels do not have this level of power in Scripture or in anywhere. It is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Trinitarian language you're seeing in the creation narrative as well as the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is basically, stark rebellion against God. Their pride and their ego. We're going up to the gates, and we're going to do it on our own. It's essentially the story. You remember the story that Jesus tells of the people coming into the sheep pen, but doing it by another way. Do you remember that story where they're not going in through the gate, but they're trying to find another way? And this is essentially the same story, is that they're trying to find God and do it another way, in their own strength, in their own power, in their own doing. We don't need God. We're good enough on our own. We can do it. And that's the story that the parable that Jesus is telling in the New Testament is that there's one way, one door, one gate that you can enter in. And if you try to go in another way, you're a thief and a robber. And it's the same story being illustrated in the Old Testament in the Tower of Babel, plus you have the challenge of God in there. So all of it is leading towards this, this further decline of humanity, where every story is dropping us down further and further. And then you're going to get to another genealogy, and this is the end. But another genealogy to round it all out. Now, this is where the story changes radically, because in here, you're going to get a glimpse of hope. If you've read through chapters 3 through 11, there's no hope in those stories. You're just depressed. You're just like, this is as bad as it could possibly get. There's no hope. We're all doomed. But when you get to chapter 11, you get this genealogy, and what you have is hope. And hope is right there at the end of the genealogy. You have the Shemites, and in their genealogy you have Abraham. And this is where the story begins to change pretty radically. And this is where I pick up reading the story historically. So yes, I believe in the parting of the Red Sea physically happened. This is where the language of the Old Testament, the original Hebrew of the Old Testament, this is where that language changes, and it appears as though it's meant now to be read historically. You're going to have a radical shift in the story being told, starting from chapter 12 all the way through. But the first 11 chapters seem to be written more poetically, more illustratively than the latter chapters of Genesis. And that's why I read it that way, not because I think the events are too unbelievable and you can't, God could never do the Tower of Babel. If he wants to do a Tower of Babel, he could. So that is the end for tonight. That's as far as I wanted to bring you, is to show you creation, the fall, the effects of the fall, and all the way to the patriarchs, which is going to begin with Abraham. Good deal? All right. Happy Lent. Talk to me about Bibles that you can read allegorically.